Lee. The helpful automated voice has just told me that this session is being recorded, as those of you who've attended before will know, so please be aware of that. And please mute yourselves when you're not speaking, because that will improve the quality for everyone else. So lovely to see you all, and welcome to the last POGO call of 2021. And we've got a great panel for you today discussing a really topical issue: how can government contracts be leveraged to improve environmental outcomes? And our panel, who I'm going to allow to introduce themselves as we go through, but I'll just tell you who's here. Our panel consists of Peter Smith, Elizabeth Forster, Kate Gough, Maria Marinari, Ian Makgill, and Fredo Schotanus. And we're very grateful to them all for giving up their time to be with us today. And we're looking forward to hear what they have to say. So without further ado, I'm going to hand straight over to Peter to kick off our panel discussion.
Thank you very much. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. I've just got a couple of slides. Right, hopefully, can you see my slides? Yes, good. Okay. Oh, let's sort of get rid of the, try and get rid of this. Right, okay, here we go. So hello, welcome. Yes, delighted to be invited to speak. Double-edged sword, because of course it is only 5 minutes, so I'll have to speak quickly. And I won't spend long on my introduction. I've been a procurement director. I've done a lot of consulting, a lot in the public sector, ex-president of SIPS, ran a website, written a few books, and my latest book literally came out this week, formally published, Procurement with Purpose. And it covers a wide range of topics, really. It's not an academic book. I'm slightly worried about this audience. You know, it's not full of brilliant academic references and all the rest of it. It's aimed largely at practitioners, but to some extent at policymakers, academics and so on as well. And it covers the background to lots of the key issues, as well as getting into practical procurement advice. And that's sort of what I'll talk about more in the next few minutes. There's quite a lot of confusion around in the terminology, and we like the Procurement with Purpose title because it is all-encompassing, or it's intended to be all-encompassing. And the public sector has, I think, added to the confusion, because the public sector talks about social value, but actually tends to include environmental and economic factors too, whereas we've tended to use the social, environmental, economic classification, of course, social factors only being one of the 3 topics there. So it is all a bit confusing sometimes, and I think even people I talk to in the public sector can get a bit confused about that. I've been doing a few webinars on this, and you know, one of the common questions is, what exactly is it you're talking about today? Because the terminology can be confusing. But there's a huge range of issues here. This session is focusing on emissions and net zero and so on. It's probably, you could argue, the most vital issue to humanity. But you know, there's some pretty big topics there, whether it's diversity and equality, human rights, fair treatment of staff and suppliers, deforestation, pollution, waste, etc., etc. So when I talk in the book about the actual what can procurement people do about all this, I sort of go through the procurement cycle and look at the different stages. And I think this is quite important, because we can address these issues at all those different points in the cycle, starting before you're even doing the procurement, educating, informing suppliers and markets what you want, moving through the supplier selection process, either using factors as a qualification or actually building them into the supplier assessment and the choosing of suppliers. Obviously, we can then put things actually in the contracts as terms and conditions, and measure and take action, feedback to suppliers, and drive improvement. And then we have the more collaborative activities, so not just managing against the contract, but working with suppliers to drive real change. And that can be just by a supplier, or it can be wider collaboration. And actually, when you look at public and private sector, I'd say both sectors, actually probably the private sector's gone further in terms of supplier selection, although some sorry, did I say private? Public sector. Some private sector companies catching up. I think both sectors are very weak on the contract management. So even where they're doing things up front, they're not particularly managing what suppliers are delivering. And I think the private sector is ahead on collaboration. The public sector does struggle because of the need to go back out to the market and recompete contracts. So there's some great initiatives in the private sector, whether it's chocolate and confectionery firms working together to improve the working conditions of their cocoa farmers, for instance, or new plastics, new materials, which might actually help the net zero position and the waste position, and their long-term collaborative activities, which the public sector struggles with a bit. So there's a lot we can do. And if you just look at climate change and net zero, you know, all those factors, all those points in the procurement cycle, we can use those, we can work through those to actually drive, encourage, force suppliers to make change and improve their own situation in terms of emissions and climate change. So when I look at the PPN, which we were asked to comment on, the UK Government Policy Note, I don't want to be negative. I mean, it's good. It's good that we're doing something. It's sort of okay as far as it goes, and I won't go through these points in detail because I've probably had my 5 minutes already. It's another barrier to entry. Doesn't apply to most of the contracts that government will let, even some quite large ones like huge frameworks. If they just say, well, the call-offs are all relatively small. 29 years away, 2050 targets. I mean, whether I'm still here in that time, I really don't know. The stuff on scope 3 emissions is a bit weird. I sort of understand why it's so limited, but if you're talking about the MOD buying tanks or NHS buying a new hospital, you know, the scope 3 emissions that are excluded from the reporting are huge. You know, they're the greater part of it. The point I made earlier about contract management is clearly a weakness already. So how is any of this going to be verified? How are we going to follow up on it? And if you go back to my previous slide, it only addresses one of the bullet points. It's a qualification exercise, which if you're being cynical, you could say it's a tick box. So firms are going to have to produce a report, tick a few boxes, submit it, and then you're through into the real supplier selection phase of the contract. So again, with my cynical hat on, is it about being seen to do the right things rather than actually driving change? And as an example of that, the UK government has had this absolutely ridiculous target about spend with SMEs for 10 years or so now that hasn't driven any real change. I'd argue it's a stupid target. And of course, it only addresses one of those, the 25 plus purpose issues that we do cover in the book, even if it is arguably the most important. So I'll rest my case there. And I hope some of you might buy the book. There's some contact details. I think we'll get these slides circulated. There's only a few. But thank you very much for listening, and happy if we have time later to take questions or have arguments or whatever.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Peter. And we will move straight on to Elizabeth Forster and Kate Gough.
Hello, thank you so much for inviting us to join the discussion. I am counsel at Freshfields, Brickhouse, Daringer, a large international law firm, and I specialise in public procurement. And Liz works in my team with me, and we advise both the government and also contractors on procurements, and also particularly on bid challenges, so challenges in the courts to procurement decisions. So we bring that perspective when looking at policies like this one. I think from my perspective, and we will be brief because I'm aware of the time, it's very interesting to think about this particular procurement policy note in the context of where the government is and its wider overarching policy and how public procurement fits into that context. As of course everyone is aware, and we've just been hearing from Peter, there is a particular and increasing focus, particularly I suppose the COP26, from the UK government and more globally on ESG and the green agenda. And of course, increasingly other international organisations like the World Bank and the OECD, as others in this call will be very familiar, are recognising the importance of sustainability in procurement, and actually just really the role of procurement in driving sustainability goals. You know, in the UK alone, there's an annual procurement spend of over £290 billion. So it's really important to think about these policies in the context of that purchasing power and how that could be used by governments across the world and in the UK to affect social change or political change or policy change in whatever field, and particularly obviously the focus today in the context of decarbonising the supply chain. And I think we are starting to see, in my mind, a real focus on across government on using procurement policy and that purchasing power in this context. And if you look at like the net zero strategy, I know Peter was talking about that more broadly in terms of the, you know, long timeline for a lot of those policies, but there were starting to be much more concrete references to leveraging public procurement as a tool that drives kind of greener and more resilient outcomes across public procurement. And if you look at the Scottish Government's kind of National Transition Training Fund that's part of that policy, they start to really look at using public procurement to build low carbon supply chains. So I think for me, and Liz is going to talk a bit about some of the strengths and perhaps the weaknesses of this particular policy note, it's just important to see this as one small tool in that government toolbox to effect change through these policies. And it's not a perfect tool. I think Peter's been very clear in his views around it not being perhaps perfect, and it isn't. But it's just starting to see some more concrete materialization of that policy. So Liz, over to you for your thoughts and some more of the detail.
Yeah, thanks, Kate, and everyone for joining. So as Kate and Peter were talking about, you are probably all aware of the procurement policy note that's been published. So just for anyone who's not quite as familiar with it, this was published in June this year. It kicks in from the 1st of October this year. And what it essentially does, it means that any company now bidding for a major government contract, which is a contract worth at least £5 million a year, excluding VAT, they have to commit to achieving net zero emissions by 2050, and they have to detail this commitment in a carbon reduction plan. So this is something that previously government contractors haven't had to think about when bidding for large government contracts. Broadly speaking, the rules apply to any contracts for goods, works or services with any central government department, executive agency or non-departmental public body. And there's a template plan that's attached to the PPN. That form has to be used when bidders are submitting their bids. In that plan, companies have to do several things, including not only setting out this commitment, but also what environmental management measures are going to apply during the performance of the contract. And that might include certification schemes or carbon reduction measures that they're going to apply. Interestingly, it also has to set out the bidder's baseline emissions footprint, and that effectively means the greenhouse gases that are being produced by the bidder prior to introducing any of these strategies to try and reduce their emissions. And as Peter was saying, this is also going to have to cover certain scope 3 emissions, and in that way it goes slightly further than other requirements that companies may already have outside the public procurement rules. So you've got the streamlined energy and carbon reporting regulations that place an obligation on some large companies to already report on their greenhouse gas emissions, but this is sort of bringing those reporting obligations into the public procurement sphere, so and introducing these requirements to report on scope 3 emissions, which is probably going to be one of the areas that bidders have the most questions around, because especially if you're a large company and you've got a sprawling supply chain, you might want to know, well, you know, how far do I have to go to set out what indirect emissions I have. It covers things like business travel, employee commuting, waste from your operations, so it could be quite broad. It isn't clear how well it's going to work yet in practice, and you can take a cynical view quite fairly, I think, and see this potentially as lip service by the government and an effort to, you know, be seen to be doing the right thing, and it becoming a tick box exercise. Taking a slightly more positive view, you could see this as just being a realistic first step by the government. It has to start somewhere, and it's probably better to start with, you know, baby steps rather than placing too many obligations on bidders too soon, because what you don't want to do is impose very unrealistic obligations that make it too difficult at all for bidders to comply with at all. So the government's actually acknowledged in several recent Q&A sessions that there is fine-tuning to do. This is the start of a journey, and the key thing for companies is to show that they've complied with the spirit of it. So they really want companies just to show that they are thinking, they're taking steps to understand their environmental impact and the carbon footprint relevant to the delivery of the contract in question. And if you compare it to other areas where the government is using procurement as a tool to pursue social objectives, another core policy focus area for the government is tackling modern slavery. And in the last couple of years, the government's been taking steps to use procurement to eradicate modern slavery in its own supply chains. And a few years ago, it published a Procurement Policy Note setting out what procurement officials have to take into account when they're selecting bidders in identifying modern slavery risks. And although that PPN as well was sort of seen as almost a bit toothless, since then more guidance has been published, and there's now extensive training programs that procurement officials are supposed to follow. So it's all about, you know, starting this journey of embedding these concepts into the procurement process. So I suspect this won't be the first of the measures to be introduced by the government to try and decarbonise government supply chains, but they've got to start somewhere.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed for those thoughts. And we'll move straight on to Maria.
Yeah, so I'm Maria. I have been working with the university on trying to develop their carbon accounting policy and looking at the commitments that they've made and how they're going to try and decarbonize their supply chain. So I'm just going to bring up some slides. So can you please let me know if thanks. Yeah, so obviously the government and thousands of different companies across the globe are making serious commitments to net zero. But what that really means is defined in completely different ways in different companies, in different countries, in different regions. So what we did at the university is we just tried to have a look at what our aims were for why we were looking at committing to net zero and the best policies that we could use within the university to make those commitments. So when looking at carbon accounting and commitments to net zero within companies, we want them to be meaningful and not just greenwashing. But at least that's what the university's current aims are. And so to do that, we want carbon accounting to be rigorous and transparent and to bring validity to the carbon commitments that are being made currently, and to help companies understand their carbon emissions across all different scopes, as well as inform companies of where to direct focus and resources into carbon reduction. But so in terms of scopes, obviously, there's been a lot of talk about scope 3 and what that includes, and generally scope 3 defines all emissions outside of our direct emissions and like non-energy related emissions, so anything other than electricity and like direct emissions from fossil fuels. And this can have like where you set the boundaries from this can massively change what you count as inside a company's emissions. So having a defined way to set those boundaries having a defined way to set those boundaries and communicating that way helps companies compare emissions between different suppliers, and it helps companies choose the best suppliers based on their carbon emissions. And where you draw the line will massively impact the carbon that you are accounting for in the end. So for instance, you can look at the products that you're purchasing, you can look at not just the upstream emissions that apply to the supply to your organization, but you can also look at the downstream emissions. What are the emissions from the use of the products that you're selling as well? And currently there are dozens of different frameworks to set the boundaries for these emissions. And from those frameworks, there are hundreds of different tools. So if taking carbon accounts from two different companies could mean completely different things, two companies with similar carbon, two companies with similar activities could have completely different carbon emissions accounts based on the standard or guidance or framework that they use, depending on the consultants that they use to do the accounting for them, the data that they had available at the time. So when the university was doing these accounts, when the university was doing their own accounts, what they looked at is they looked for a framework that would be the most rigorous and thorough and go furthest into the supply chain. And it found that using the greenhouse gas protocol, which is a protocol produced by the World Resource Institute, was the most appropriate to use. And it meant that once the university was using a guideline like this, that the Scope 3 emissions accounted for over 10 times the amount of emissions from your Scope 1 and 2 categories. And once you're including those, your carbon emissions look wildly different. So the university is hoping that by leading by example and accounting for these emissions, that other companies will account for them as well. That other companies will account for them as well and will take more responsibility for the emissions that we have influence over as companies. Thanks. Sorry.
Fantastic, thank you, Maria. And our next speaker is Ian. Over to you.
Always forget to unmute myself. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to. Well, I'll start by telling you a little bit about the work that we've been doing, and then follow up showing you some example of some work we've done on carbon analysis and gender disparity. But I run Spend Network. We're effectively an agency that collects up all the data on procurement in the world and tries to make sense of it and tries to make it accessible. And one of the things that we like trying to do is trying to use the data to solve the problems that we think face both government and their suppliers, and to do it in as effective way as we possibly can with the data that's available to us. So let me start by sharing our carbon dashboard. You can see this is freely available, by the way, at spendnetwork.com/carbon, and it probably takes a little bit of explanation. So what we basically did was we took all of the available data on contracting in the public sector in the UK, reclassified it basically because a lot of the classifications were wrong, and then or a lot of them didn't have classifications, and then use that to establish the likely carbon output from each of those contracts. And then we looked at what would be the impact over time if at the point of renewal we were able to reduce the carbon emissions by either 20, 50 or 80%. So you can see from here that what we were seeing is that even if you get to a 20%, a 50% rather, which is a very high target reduction in emissions, we would still be producing more carbon. We would still be producing something around 35 million tons from our contracts. If we looked at reducing them at renewals, you could see that these reductions sort of really indicate that we possibly could get to something close to a heavy reduction down to 54,000 tons by 2030 if we got to 80%. Now, obviously, we're assuming that each contract would be renewed and that the spec wouldn't necessarily change other than to reduce carbon. But as a projection, it's quite an interesting exercise. The challenge we've got is actually that a lot of the data just isn't fit for purpose. So only 60% of the documents had a value and only 74% had an end date. And when you combine those, basically, we really only ended up with 40% that could be analyzed. So actually 60% of the data is missing from this analysis. And then the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that the largest average monthly emissions by buyer is Poole Hospitals NHS Foundation Trust, which might give anyone looking at this analysis cause for concern on the accuracy. Salisbury coming in under there as well. I think it's a fat finger for an electricity contract. They're claiming that their framework is going to attract something like 500 billion, or I can't remember, in terms of electricity. But it's that some of the problems we have with frameworks where the incentive is to overstate the value so that you don't expand beyond the value of the framework over the lifetime. So long 30-year contracts, you know, with optimistic values are part of the problem. Obviously, here you can see that when we look at the total, huge amount of it is in central government, and that's where we need to be looking for savings. And actually, we could, you know, the bulk of the savings could come from central government. Where we need to make savings is in electricity, primarily moving over to renewable sources, construction work, but we note that construction is exempted from the PPN, which is a little bit of a shame. And obviously fuels, electrical machinery, and then medical equipment, also quite a problematic source of carbon. So as I say, this is free. You can change your sector. You can start looking around at different departments, and you can go and look at your categories as well. We present the data. We try and do a good enough job of presenting the data, but we don't take stuff out because it looks wrong. We're giving you everything that is available to us, partly because it's free and we don't have time to go through all of the weeding that needs to be done, but also because it's actually a point that we can make that actually the data is not really good, or could be better. Another report that I think you might be interested in is this work we did on procuring inequality, effectively linking the contracting data of the key suppliers to the gender data. So the gender data of the gender pay gap data. And we found when we looked at the value of contracts going to companies according to their pay bias, that 94% of companies receiving government contracts had a positive pay bias in favour of men, which is a fairly disappointing start. I'm not saying it gets much better, but we found that at least the government departments were better than the national average for pay bias, but that as a whole, public sector suppliers, and particularly the strategic suppliers, were worse than the national average. If you look at the ministerial departments, we have an average there, and only Treasury had a negative pay bias in favour of women. When we look at the strategic suppliers, actually there's some really disappointing numbers in there. A 39% pay bias for one supplier just seems indefensible. But there we go. Then I'm quite pleased with this visualization that shows the difference. And you could argue whether government is actually only achieving this better performance because they're outsourcing some of their more difficult functions and thereby effectively outsourcing inequality. I will scoot down here. This one was quite interesting, which was very quickly my last point. If you, I won't make you read all of this. Basically, in construction, the more you spend, the greater the pay bias. In business services and consulting, the less you spend, the greater the pay bias. So that felt quite revealing. Anyway, so this is the sort of the work that we do, and we think it's quite interesting. Unfortunately, the gender pay gap was sort of met with, I think I can call it a universal shrug by everyone except for 3 suppliers who were incensed that we'd actually taken their the pay bias of the companies that were awarded contracts rather than the pay bias so they might have 16 companies and then they blend it together and say, oh, well, that's our pay bias, and we said, no, we'll take the ones where you're actually awarded contracts and we'll use that. And they were livid with us for that, but there we go. So that's us.
Fantastic, thanks, Ian. And last but very much not least, over to Fredo.
Right, thank you, Anne. Try and share my screen. So hope you can see it now. Yes, all right, great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. My name is Fredo Schotanus. I'm a part-time professor at Utrecht University for the chair of Public Procurement. So it's important to mention the schools that I work for the Department of Economics. So I'm not a legal researcher, but I look at the public procurement from a management side, from an economics side. And I've been asked to give you a short presentation about the network that we have at the university, which also involves the legal researchers and 2 special editions for academic journals. But before I do that, I just wanted to reflect very shortly on the previous presentation of Ian. It's not that often that I'm surprised by data on public procurement, but you did surprise me. It's actually quite some shocking numbers that you presented there. So thank you very much. I'll have a closer look at your data. Very relevant what you do. Before I go to the special issues for the 2 journals I mentioned, at Utrecht University, we collaborate with the legal department, but also with our geosciences department. And we all work on the topic of public procurement. And we do that, of course, interdisciplinary. We actually had today a joint meeting the whole day for PhD presentations. Several of them on sustainability, but also on other important issues, current issues that we have in the public sector and public domain related to procurement. And what we aim to do, both on the legal side and economic side, we aim to contribute to improving the utilization, regulation, promotion of social, sustainable use of public procurement, but also to do it in an effective and efficient way. If you're interested in our network, what we do more, I included a link, a LinkedIn link to our page. I'll also share it in the chat. And you can see the type of work that we do. Just for your information, the main topics that we research at our university are about efficient effectiveness, about responsible commissioning. Specific focus area is military procurement and national security. And last but definitely not least, fighting corruption, increasing integrity.
I think we've got a problem. Oh, Fredo, are you back? I think you just froze for a little bit there.
All right, just give me a second. I'll switch in my net. I hope it's better now. In the Netherlands, we implemented a public procurement policy for central government, and we studied the actual effects of this policy on tender behavior. Another research that we do is looking at the CO2 emissions related to public contracts and how we can explain when this is reduced, what the type of behavior is actually required to make sure that's not a tick box exercise or an audit clausule somewhere in your contract that you don't actually do, but where you see actual reduction of emissions. And currently, that was the other number that surprised me this year. The current CO2 emissions related to public contracts in the Netherlands is 18% of our country. And that's a lot. We also have quite some heavy industry, but still 18% of our CO2 emissions can be directly related to public contracts. And, raw material use even more. So that there's a lot to do. So that's the research that we do. And the two special editions I shortly wanted to share with you. The first one is sustainability. The guest editors for this special issue are Makgill, Kees Gelderman, and myself. It's a very broad special issue about sustainable public procurement. So we welcome both legal papers, management papers, and economic papers. We look, of course, to new contributions. So there's a lot in literature already known on drivers and barriers, but not so much on effects and how to actually realize, for instance, CO2 emissions or more social contributions. So those are the topics that we think are really interesting for this special issue. If you have an idea, if you have an abstract, feel free to contact me and we can discuss it in more detail. And the final one is the special issue for public management review. This is a special issue that we do together with Katri Kaupin, Carmela Di Mauro, and Andrea Petrucco, all from different universities all over the world. And this one is actually only focused on management papers. And idea of the special issue is that nowadays governments more and more need private organizations or non-profits to realize their objectives, sustainability and social side, and many other objectives that can be there. And we think that we don't utilize the suppliers currently sufficiently. So we can use them better to a larger extent, and to try to focus this special issue on how to do that. So how can we better utilize our suppliers to realize our policy objectives that we have as governments. So focus on management, theoretical papers are welcomed, literature review to a smaller extent, they really need to add something to current literature. Again, if you have an idea, if you have an abstract, feel free to contact me and we can discuss in more detail. Thanks for your attention so far.
Great, thank you very much indeed. So we have time now for discussion. I can go back to the panel and see if they want to react to each other, but let's see first if any members of the audience would like to get involved. I see there's been a lively discussion going on in the chat, but I'm sure you still have some questions. Please raise your digital hand if you'd like to intervene, and I will invite you to speak.
We have Malcolm with his digital hand up.
We certainly do. Malcolm, the floor is yours. Malcolm, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Thank you, Anne. Sorry. Yes, I think it's been a very interesting discussion. I think very complementary to the session that we had last month about the whole question about how you manage strategic procurement. And in that context, I just want to make a point that I put in the chat, because one of the other projects I've been working on with the European Policy Centre is the whole question about standards. And it seems to me that we will not make serious progress in terms of encouraging or incentivizing public procurement authorities to meet zero carbon targets unless there are some clear set of agreed measurement standards. And it's been very interesting. A number of the presentations have set out some of the range of standards as there at the moment. And that, of course, that's very confusing for public authorities. And if the UK government is serious about this, and I think other governments have to be as well, then I do think the success of any move towards facilitating and incentivizing zero carbon procurement has got to be a clearly agreed set of standards that can be used in setting out the criteria, the objective criteria on which you make the procurement. And then secondly, I would observe that, as we discussed last time on our question about innovation procurement, that actually a competitive dialogue process that obviously looks at the best performing standards and the overall cost and timescale is clearly indispensable. If that requires new technologies or partly developed technologies, new application of technologies, then I would argue that our innovation procurement process comes into play.
Thank you, Malcolm. What I suggest we do is collect up a few more questions and then go back to our panel. So anybody else like to come in before we do that? You can wave at me, you can raise your digital hand as you prefer. Okay. Oh, I was going to say we're having a quiet day today, but here's Mark. Hello, Mark. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, hi, thanks, Anne. Yeah, it's just a comment really for me as someone who works in local authority procurement. We've done a lot of work around this, and as I said in the chat, it was refreshing to see what Peter said really around looking at the opportunities that actually rest there in the procurement process to actually do something positive. Having had a good go at this across lots of commodities, I think one of the challenges I'm finding is it's just an issue of knowledge and understanding, with all the wide range of things that all public sector bodies buy, understanding what the environmental issues and opportunities are. But it's fairly obvious when you're dealing with transport, for instance, you need to be switching to electric vehicles. That's fairly obvious. But you get into some of the more murkier areas and areas such as IT, medical equipment, for instance. That was really interesting to see that one so high on the list. But I wouldn't know where to start with understanding what the key risks are around medical equipment and what I would want my suppliers to do differently. So for me, it's just a matter of I'm just wondering whether there's any sort of commodity guidance available that can help anybody, whether anybody's involved in working on this. It would be helpful, I think, to look at the things that are bought across the public sector and say these are the things that you need to focus on. Because you can ask suppliers to go and measure it all you like. You're just killing time really before the really important bit, when you actually have to ask them to contract to do something differently. And very often I find they don't necessarily know what the issues are, and they don't know what their environmental impacts are from the things that they're doing as well. So I think it would be helpful if centrally there could be something coming down to say these commodity areas are the things you need to think about.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark, for that practical perspective, which I think is really important and helpful. So what I'm going to do now is just go back around the panel in turn to see if you'd like to respond to the questions that we've heard, if you'd like to respond to anything else that you've heard from your fellow panelists. And I suppose if I can just insert a challenge from me into the discussion, I think what I'd love to hear from each of you is what one change would make a real difference here? What single reform would make this work better? Because I felt there was quite a lot of, it's box ticking, it's difficult to measure, the different measurement tools aren't comparable, all of those different problems and concerns coming out quite rightly. So what is it that you would like to see done that would make this work better? So I'll go first. I'll go back in order. So first to Peter.
I think maybe building on what Mark said and a couple of the other questions, getting contracting authorities to really focus on where they can make a difference given their situation and their procurement profile and their supplier profile and so on. Because, a local authority is totally different from MOD, which is totally different from a hospital, which is totally different from a school. And everybody can make a difference, but it'll be in quite different ways. So, approaching it as Cabinet Office these days tends to do on a sort of top-down basis, which I do understand, doesn't really work. And some of the comments about, well, if the net zero thing excludes construction, and it doesn't ask MOD suppliers to talk about the steel and metal they use and so on, then it's pretty meaningless, really. So I think getting people to really focus on their own spend and where they can make a difference.
Fantastic, thank you, Peter. Liz, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, so I suppose to add a few comments from the perspective of our clients. So we have contractors who come to us and say, help, we've seen this new guidance and we have limited resources and we need to know how we actually are going to comply with this. From their perspective, a lot of them want to do the right thing and they're aware that there are opportunities in public procurement as well, and that most of our clients don't resist these sorts of changes. The challenges for them is when they have to go in front of the board and say, here's the new guidance, here are the new requirements, here is what we need to do. And if you look at the guidance that's been produced to date, it is to some extent motherhood and apple pie, saying, everybody wants to do the right thing and this is the start of a nice journey. But if you dig a bit deeper in the guidance, essentially bidders won't be selected if they point blank haven't submitted a plan. There's very few circumstances in which a bidder actually will not be selected on the basis of its plan. So I expect that in the next few months and years we'll have clients saying to us, help, what exactly do we need to do? And we'll be stuck saying there's actually not very much guidance. So it's quite, here's what we think you have to do, but it's quite tricky to advise. And I think actually the government isn't quite sure yet how it's going to work as well, because there's probably limited resources on that side as well to analyse, scope 3 emissions, for example. So what we would love to see is granular guidance for bidders. But again, going back to the modern slavery example, I expect it will take quite a bit of time for that to materialise.
Fantastic, thank you. Maria, any concluding thoughts from you or responses to those questions?
Yeah, well, just to echo Elizabeth's point, I think clear guidance is what will be most important, because from doing this process myself, it is a huge data processing undertaking that, like I'm a PhD student in engineering. Data processing is what I do on a regular basis. This is it's something that is would be very expensive to do if you didn't have in-house expertise to report properly and rigorously, and like it's very easy to make mistakes on as well, and report incorrect numbers. So clear, understandable guidance. And there needs to be an auditing process that's involved as well in reporting carbon accounts.
Fantastic, thank you. And Ian, any concluding thoughts from you?
Yes, and just taking Malcolm's point, part of me 100% agrees that, you know, we as a data analyst and someone who believes in good data, it's you know, we feel like, yeah, we need to do better on data and have consistent measures. But I've also seen people say, well, we can't do anything until we get the measurements right. And at which point you just go, well, we've been at this for long enough, and we have to accept the data we've got. As I mean, we got, I put we put some data in front of the European Union, and they this same thing, and they were like, oh, well, that's not nearly accurate enough. And I said, well, look, it's what we've got. It's enough to get started. Surely that's acceptable. So I think there's a trade-off we have to accept. In terms of what would I like to see, I mean, I really think that it's time for government to institute a challenge fund to take 6 or 7 key industries or categories and initiate a challenge fund that rewards any contractor and buyer with a pot of money for achieving a 50% reduction in carbon emissions on a key contract. And I'm not talking about you know, hairdressing in prisons. I'm talking about construction and cloud computing. And to then, if you say, well, look, this is, and to set it up so that people can then learn from that and replicate it. So if you can put, you know, £500,000 into a supplier's pocket for achieving that and creating a forward leap in competitiveness that then makes other suppliers have to catch up, you're going to make a real difference. If you stand here saying, I want to see a PDF on your website, you're not. And it's really a question of, are you willing to put your money where your mouth is? And that's that.
Sorry, I'm muted now. Thank you very much indeed, Ian, for that. Fredo, any concluding thoughts from you?
Sure. Maybe 3 if the time is there. I'll keep it short.
You have to keep it short.
Yeah, sure. No, don't worry. So the first one that we're looking into in the Netherlands more and more is use all of the freedom that we have below the EU directives for public procurement. So we do 170,000 tenders each year in the Netherlands. 164,000 of them are below the thresholds. And below the thresholds, we have quite some room to invite suppliers that we like. So that the idea is invite the good ones to submit a bid. And notify the suppliers that you know that they don't want to change behavior, they don't do what they promise they should do, they don't show social behavior, they don't show sustainable behavior. And so invite more often suppliers that have female owners, for instance. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I'm not sure how that is in England. In the Netherlands, we often copy the tender documents from the previous tender. I think that's a common mistake made very often. Never do that. Always copy the best practice currently. When developments are so quickly, when sustainability is such an important topic, we need to change things, to change behavior. And you don't change things if you copy the tender as you did it the previous time. And the final one, I realize also in the chat there are many comments about how difficult it is to measure actual sustainable or social behavior of suppliers. I know that's true in many cases, but also sometimes it's not that difficult to measure. Public transport, we contract that's zero emission. That's easy to measure. You just look at the back end of the bus, and it doesn't have an don't know the English words. Exhaust pipe, I guess. Sorry for that. That sometimes it's easy to measure. If your work should be circular, that's more difficult, but also there with an expert, you can measure that. But I fully agree with Ian. You need sometimes money to actually realize that, and also to have the attention in actually going to the actual work, to the service, and see whether the promises are actually fit. I hope that's sure enough, Anne.
That was brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. I I think we're coming to the end of our time, so I'm afraid we can't take any more questions at this stage. Thank you very much to everyone who's contributed to the discussion, to our wonderful panel, and thank you all for the lively discussion in the chat, which I've been enjoying with one eye on it, at least anyway. So thank you all very much indeed for that. We have an end of year survey. Lee will either drop a link into the chat or send you an email. There's the link going into the chat. We would encourage you to complete that. It's anonymous. It takes stock of your experience with POGO over the last year. And in particular, it asks you to look at what topics you'd like us to cover next year, and what outputs we might be able to deliver. And so it's your opportunity to shape these calls and to contribute to the development of our programme for the coming year. And obviously, we're very, very keen to hear your feedback. That we hope that these sessions are interesting and enjoyable for you, but obviously the more we can learn about what you're interested in, the better we can do on that front. So we would really encourage you to complete that survey. And of course, at any point during the year, if you've got a suggestion for a topic, if you'd like to organise it or you'd like us to organise it, then please get in touch with Lee or Rory, and they will set wheels in motion for that. So please, it's your network, so please do get involved in how we take it forward. So our next meeting is on January the 25th, 2022. It's 2022 already, the next meeting, which sounds terrifying, at the usual 4 o'clock GMT. So very much looking forward to seeing all of you then, and I hope you have a lovely and restful break. Thank you all very much indeed, and thanks again to our panelists and to everyone who's contributed. Thank you.
Thank you.